Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're diving deep into the story of Noah's Ark, but we're going way beyond what we all learned as kids.
Yeah, we're going deep.
Exactly. You, our amazing listeners, have sent us this fascinating article, and it looks at some of the more, well, I guess, mysterious or lesser-known parts of this whole story, like what kinds of creatures were actually on board, right? And even what might have been going on in the spiritual realm at the same time.
Ooh, it's interesting.
So joining us to help us break it all down and really understand these accounts is our expert on all things biblical. I'm so excited to explore this with you.
Likewise. This is going to be a fun one.
Oh yeah, right off the bat, the article highlights something that I don't know about you, but I had never really thought about. It points out that fish and other sea creatures aren't ever mentioned as being on the ark.
You know, it's funny you mentioned that.
Right. Did ancient people not think that a global flood would affect them?
Well, it could be that ancient Hebrew texts just categorized animals differently than we do. Yeah. And the flood is always described as destroying all flesh with the breath of life, which, potentially excludes fish from that definition.
So maybe they weren't even seen as needing a place on the ark.
Well, that's possible.
We tend to just lump all animals together in our modern thinking, but they might have had totally different classification systems back then.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. If you look at Genesis, for example, it groups birds and fish together, like they were created on the same day. Then land animals come later. So the flood narrative might have been way more focused on those creatures that were directly impacted on the land.
Okay, yeah. I guess it's easy for us to just picture this massive boat with two of everything marching up a ramp, like the classic image. But maybe the ancient Israelites had a different perspective altogether.
Oh, absolutely.
This whole thing about how they categorized animals actually brings up another interesting point from the article. This distinction between clean and unclean animals. So Noah was told to take 7 of every clean animal, but only 2 of the unclean. What was the reasoning there? Why the difference?
Well, the idea of clean versus unclean is really central to the Old Testament, especially in Leviticus. It's all tied to ritual purity, what's suitable for consumption, and even sacrifice.
Gotcha. So like sheep would be clean, but not pigs.
Right.
I'm trying to think of like modern equivalents, but it's just such a different framework.
Oh, totally. Hard to map onto our modern categories. But yeah, sheep were often used for sacrifice, making them clean. Some types of fish were clean, while others, like shellfish, were not.
Oh, wow. My mind is kind of blown here. The article even mentions that insects could be clean, like locusts. What purpose would that have served on the ark?
Well, that's an excellent question. The larger number of clean animals, it might indicate that they were meant for sacrifice after the flood, not just for repopulating the earth. So maybe a deeper, more ritualistic purpose was woven into the whole story.
Wow. It makes you think about the ark as more than just this big lifeboat, right?
Right.
It's connected to this whole complex system of beliefs and practices.
It is.
Speaking of complex systems, the article goes into some pretty mysterious territory with the Nephilim. They're described as giants, these mighty men of old. And honestly, I've always found that whole part a little unsettling.
Oh, for sure. The Nephilim are definitely one of the most enigmatic parts of the whole narrative.
Yeah. So Genesis talks about the sons of God taking wives from the daughters of men. And having these offsprings who became the Nephilim. And that's where it gets really tricky, right? Who are these sons of God? Are we talking fallen angels, some kind of demigod? It's really left open to a lot of interpretation.
Yeah, there's a whole range of interpretations out there. Some scholars think fallen angels, others a divine lineage. But the text itself, it doesn't really give us a definitive answer.
Okay, so this is probably a good point to just clarify something for everyone listening. We are going to be looking at a lot of different interpretations today, but we are not endorsing any one specific viewpoint. The goal is to just present what's out there, not tell you what to believe.
I think that's important.
Right. Just encouraging critical thinking and asking questions, not, dogma.
Definitely.
All right, back to the Nephilim. The article brings up this idea that they were a major factor in God's decision to send the flood. Is that a common view? Like, do most people see it that way?
Well, the text definitely links the Nephilim to the growing wickedness in the world at that time.
Right.
But whether they were the direct cause of the flood, that's where the debate comes in.
Oh, interesting.
Some scholars argue that they were more of a symptom of this broader human rebellion against God.
So it's all in how you interpret those passages.
Exactly.
And even if the flood was intended to wipe out that wickedness, The article points out that giants still pop up again later on in the Bible.
Mhm.
So how could that be if the Nephilim were supposed to be, gone?
Well, that's the paradox, isn't it? The book of Numbers describes the Israelites encountering giants in Canaan.
Right.
And that's well after the flood is supposed to have happened, so that raises questions.
Yeah.
Were they descendants of the Nephilim, or was there some other interaction
Mm-hmm.
between spiritual beings and humans that carried on after the flood? It's fascinating.
That's what I love about these deep dives. It's not about finding all the answers.
Yeah,
It's about opening up new questions and exploring different possibilities.
I agree.
Speaking of exploring, the article takes a pretty fascinating turn when it starts talking about what might have been happening in the spiritual realm when Jesus died.
Mm.
So buckle up, everyone, because this is where things get really interesting.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. This idea of what was going on in the spiritual realm while Jesus was dying, it's definitely thought-provoking.
Yeah, it really is. And the article quotes this passage from 1 Peter. That suggests Jesus, after he died but before the resurrection, right, that he actually went to the realm of the dead and preached to the spirits who were imprisoned there.
Yeah. That passage has been interpreted in so many ways.
Oh, I bet.
Some people take it very literally, like it was a historical event. Others see it more symbolically.
It makes you wonder what that in-between time might have been like.
Yeah.
If we take a literal approach, it begs the question, who were these spirits that Jesus was preaching to, the ones in prison?
Right, and that's a really important question that we don't get an explicit answer to in the text.
Yeah.
Some people connect it back to the flood narrative, thinking that maybe these spirits were those who died during the flood, but there are other interpretations too, looking at it more symbolically.
So it's almost like there's this added layer to the whole story. Like we've got the physical world dealing with the flood's aftermath, but then at the same time, there's this spiritual event happening too.
Yeah, it adds a whole other dimension to how we understand what Jesus' sacrifice meant.
Right.
Did his work extend to those who had died before he came? It brings up some deep theological questions.
Oh, absolutely. It's incredible how these ancient texts can still spark such debate, even after all this time. You mentioned the symbolic interpretations. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. Some see Jesus' descent into the realm of the dead not as a literal thing, but more as a representation of his triumph over death itself.
Oh, I see.
It's this powerful image showing how complete his victory was over sin and the grave.
That makes sense. Almost like a cosmic battle was going on.
Oh,
Jesus
cosmic battle.
venturing into the darkest place to free those who were captive.
That's a good way to look at it. And it ties into this idea of spiritual warfare,
Right.
which we see throughout the Bible. That's in the story of the Nephilim too, right? This intrusion of darkness into the world. Then in the New Testament, we see Jesus directly confronting and overcoming those dark powers.
So it's not just about literal giants and floods. It's about this much deeper fight between good and evil, light and darkness that spans all the time.
Exactly. And it makes us think about how that same struggle might be playing out in our own lives, too.
Mhm.
What are our floods or giants that we face? How do we fight those inner battles and find the strength to choose good over evil?
It's almost like those epic battles in the Bible are reflected within us, but on a smaller scale. Like, we may not be facing down literal giants, but we each have our own struggles with temptation and doing what's right.
And that's where Noah's example is so powerful. I mean, the world around him was falling apart, full of chaos and wickedness, yet he chose to walk with God. It shows us
Huh.
that even when things are really bad, we can choose to side with goodness and light.
And it reminds us that we're not alone in those struggles. Like the article says,
Wow.
we can create our own arcs, our own spaces of safety and strength, where we can build up our faith, our compassion, our hope.
I love that. It brings us back to that idea of being prepared spiritually. Remember, Noah built the ark before the flood came. It wasn't a last-minute thing. So in the same way, we can ask ourselves, what are we doing to prepare ourselves spiritually? Through prayer, meditation, connecting with others, all those things that give us strength, so we can face our own challenges with wisdom and courage.
Like a proactive approach to spirituality. Instead of waiting for something bad to happen and then scrambling to react.
Right. It's about laying a solid foundation before the storm hits.
Speaking of storms, though, the article also draws this interesting parallel between the time of Noah and what it calls the end times. How does that fit into this whole idea of spiritual warfare and building our own arcs?
Well, in Luke's gospel, Jesus compares the time just before the flood to the end times. He talks about how people were just going about their daily lives, focused on eating and drinking, getting married, building houses just like in Noah's day. It's a warning to us not to lose sight of what's really important, to not get so caught up in material things that we neglect our spiritual side.
That comparison is really striking. especially when you consider how much our modern world values material success and instant gratification.
Yeah. It makes you wonder, are we kind of repeating the same mistakes, the
Right.
same distractions, the same denial that led to the flood in the first place?
Are we so busy building bigger barns that we forget to build those arks for our souls?
It's a question we all need to ask ourselves, and it challenges us to look at what we truly value.
Hmm.
Are we living in a way that's aligned with our deepest beliefs? Are we investing in what really matters, like our relationships, our compassion, our search for wisdom? Or are we letting ourselves get swept away by all the consumerism and superficiality of the world?
It really makes you think, right? Are we focusing on the right things?
It does. And, the article goes on to talk about how after the flood was over, Noah actually planted a vineyard.
Hmm.
It's kind of a striking image, especially after all that destruction and loss.
Yeah, that image of the vineyard really stayed with me too. It's almost like this defiant act of hope, like refusing to give in to despair, even after something as horrific as a global flood.
It really is. And it connects back to something we've been talking about this whole time, this idea of building arcs, not just physical ones like Noah did, but metaphorical ones too.
Right, those inner spaces where we can find refuge and strength.
Yeah.
And cultivate those qualities like faith and compassion and hope.
Exactly. And the article makes this interesting link between the story of Noah's Ark and the environmental challenges that we're facing today.
Hmm.
It's easy to dismiss these old stories as irrelevant to our modern world, but there are some pretty striking parallels.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, we're living in this time of unprecedented climate change with the sea levels rising and all these extreme weather events. And I think there's a growing awareness that we humans are having a huge impact on the planet. It's almost like we're facing our own kind of flood in a way.
It is, and it makes you wonder, are we, in some ways, repeating the same mistakes that led to the flood in the first place?
Yeah.
Are we ignoring the warning signs and just continuing down this path of destruction?
It's a scary thought. And it brings up the whole question of responsibility. In the Noah story, right, it's humanity's wickedness that causes God to send the flood. But today, we understand so much more about the science behind what's happening. Does that change where the responsibility lies?
Well, it definitely adds another layer, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We can't just say that climate change is divine judgment anymore. We have to acknowledge that human actions are playing a big part in these environmental shifts.
Right.
And with that knowledge comes a responsibility to do something about it, to make different choices, to try to lessen our impact and create a more sustainable future.
So almost like we're being called to build a different kind of ark this time.
Yeah.
One that's focused on protecting the entire planet.
I like that. What would that look like, practically speaking?
That's a good question. And I think it has to involve so many things. I mean, individual choices like reducing our own carbon footprint and supporting sustainability, but also bigger systemic changes, like policies that prioritize renewable energy and protect our natural resources and promote environmental justice.
It's about finding ways to live in balance with the earth, to
Yeah.
recognize how everything is interconnected, which is what Noah's story shows us too, right? How humanity and the natural world are totally dependent on each other.
And you know what else I find interesting? Even amidst all that devastation, Noah wasn't just told to save the animals. He was also instructed to make offerings to God. After the flood subsided, it points to something deeper, this spiritual element within the story.
You're right. It suggests that even when we're dealing with an environmental crisis, even while we're working to rebuild and take care of the planet, there's this parallel need for spiritual renewal as well.
It's not just about the outer work, but the inner work too.
Exactly. It's about developing those inner qualities that lead to a reverence for creation, compassion for all beings, and a commitment to justice and peace. It's about understanding that true sustainability. It goes beyond just the physical world. It has to include the spiritual and ethical dimensions too.
I love that. It's not just about wind turbines and planting trees. It's about cultivating this deeper sense of connection, responsibility, and purpose.
And that brings us back to one of the key takeaways from this whole deep dive. The story of Noah's Ark. It's not just some ancient tale, it's a living story that still challenges us and inspires us today.
I agree.
It shows us that humans are capable of both incredible destruction and incredible renewal, of selfishness, but also of great sacrifice.
And in the end, it all comes down to a choice, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Will we repeat the same mistakes that have been made before? Or will we rise to meet these challenges with wisdom, compassion, and courage? Will we build those arcs of hope? Or will we just let ourselves be swept away by apathy and despair?
Those are powerful questions. And as we're all trying to navigate this complex world, Maybe the wisdom in this ancient story can be like a guide for us, pointing us towards a future where both humanity and the planet can flourish.
It has been so fascinating to explore this story with you, and I hope everyone listening is leaving with a sense of wonder and possibility and a sense of responsibility too.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. But remember, the conversation doesn't stop here. Keep asking those questions, keep seeking wisdom, and keep building those arcs of hope, both within yourselves and in the world around you.
Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.